second KKK in the early 1900s didn't like a lot of people, blacks, Catholics, Jews, and they in particular thought that they were going to Americanize everybody to be sort of the white Protestant majority that the KKK thought was good. And so they did not like the waves of Italian and Irish Catholic immigrants coming into the country. And the second KKK organized to keep them out, to keep them out of polite society, to keep them from getting jobs, to keep their schools from getting funded. From typically anti-Catholic reasons like thinking, well, you're not loyal to America if you're loyal to the Pope or to the Catholic Church, to, I think, frankly, thinking they compete for jobs and they come in and they have a lot of children and that might jeopardize political control. So there are a lot of reasons why the KKK didn't like Catholics and Jews, in addition to obviously their traditional dislike of blacks and other minorities. The conflict in Oregon really arises from the fact that the public schools back then were not religion-free zones. The public schools back then were in some ways designed to Americanize and Protestantize the children of immigrants. And so they would do things like read from the King James Bible and make them say Protestant versions of prayers rather than Catholic ones. And so the Catholics' response to this in many places was to say, well, let's start our own schools and educate our own children. And what the second KKK and other opponents of this immigration did was they tried to put provisions into state law to say that either you must send your kids to the government-run schools, which are, again, essentially Protestant at the time, or that no government money could ever go to a private religious school. And the goals of all of these things were essentially to kill the Catholic school system so that you would force the immigrant Catholics to put their children into the government-run schools where, just like the second KKK wanted, they would be given, American, non-Catholic Protestant views of things. And so the Knights of Columbus joined with other groups, and it wasn't just Catholics who fought this. There were Jewish groups who fought it, there were Protestant groups who fought it, but the Knights joined with these groups to oppose these kinds of laws in Oregon and other places to say that we really ought not have the government interfering and telling parents where and how they can educate their children. And that ended up being a very successful work from the Knights, bringing together people of other faiths too to join that fight. The key question is whether the government or the parents get to decide how the child gets educated. And in Oregon, the government was trying to say, essentially, the children belong to the state, and the state gets to decide how we're going to mold their minds and how we're going to shape their thinking. And what the Supreme Court did in the Pierce case was it said, no, the parents have rights to direct the upbringing and education of their children. That doesn't mean that the government doesn't get to make sure that they're really learning math or they're really learning social studies. The government can still have a say, but the parents get to decide if they want their children educated in a religious environment. And that decision was made 100 years ago, and it has really stood the test of time. The Pierce case is really foundational for the right of parents to control the education of their children, that the children really do belong to their parents, not to the government, and the parents get to decide if they want the child educated in a Jewish school or a Muslim school or a Catholic school or a public school. All of those are choices that parents get to make, and the government does not get to force people. Joseph Smith arises in a period known as the Second Great Awakening, where there's really a flowering in America of a bunch of different, religious groups saying that they've had revelations or they've got new ideas about religion, and America is a free place. And so in a lot of different places, these groups grow up. Upstate New York, where Joseph Smith was, happened to be a place where there was a lot of this type of religious ferment. And Joseph Smith began the Mormon Church, began teaching what he said had been revealed to him, began sending out missionaries to Europe and other places to bring in new members. But ultimately, his group would clash with civil government in a lot of places, where the civil government said, we don't want your group here. We don't like your religious beliefs. Later on, it would be, we don't like your religious beliefs about plural marriage. But essentially, the Mormons end up getting chased from New York to Ohio, to Missouri, to Illinois, and then finally to Utah, with each of these places not being very happy to have this new religious group in their midst and finding ways to get rid of them, to the point of violence and murder, right? The governor of Missouri will issue an order called the Mormon Extermination Order that literally was an order from the governor that said these people must leave or we will kill them. That's a pretty nasty chapter in American history. In 1831, when the governor issues the Mormon extermination order, he can do that because the Bill of Rights, the protection for religious liberty, doesn't yet apply to state governments. It's not until we get to the 14th Amendment that that protection will apply to state governments. And so the governor of Missouri can say, your religion's no good here, and can essentially chase people out, and frankly, some of them got killed because we didn't have those protections yet against our state governments. In the early part of our history, the state governments were the main actors who did things, and the federal government didn't. And so you have a long part of our history where there are no free exercise cases at all because the federal government isn't really interfering with free exercise. The 14th Amendment is supposed to change that by making the Bill of Rights applicable to the states, but the court really only takes it up in bits and pieces when it shows up at their doorstep. Joseph Smith, when he goes to Washington, runs into the same problem that the slaves were running into at this point, which is Martin Van Buren, in particular, a lot of the presidents are big proponents of states' rights, and lurking behind every states' rights question at the time is making sure the slave states get to keep their slaves. Martin Van Buren, who sympathized with slave owners, just was not in a position to say he's going to, protect Smith at the expense of states' rights. Yeah. The key thing the framers of the 14th Amendment were trying to do is make the individual rights from the Bill of Rights applicable as against the states. The radical Republican Congress in the 1860s knew quite well that the former Confederate states would treat the former slaves very badly, and they wanted to have a way to make federal power and federal guarantees of rights applicable even within the states. So that was the basic idea of the 14th Amendment, and ultimately, that's how it's functioned. Ultimately, the court has gotten around to saying most of those Bill of Rights protections that we're familiar with, including the free exercise of religion, really do act to protect you against state and local governments too. You don't start getting cases getting to the Supreme Court over free exercise until the 1940s and 50s. And that's when the court says, okay, now we'll apply the Bill of Rights and the Free Exercise Clause to the states. Cantwell is part of this era of cases in the 1940s and 50s where the court starts to say, yes, we recognize that the Free Exercise Clause protects you not only against the federal government, but against state governments that would restrict your rights. And so you get Cantwell, and you also get the early flag salute cases like Gobitis and Barnett, in which the court eventually gets to a strong protection for free exercise rights as against state and local governments. After Gobitis, there is awful, terrible mistreatment and attacks, dragging people out of their homes, castrating people to force them to pledge allegiance to the flag against the views of their religion. The ACLU actually writes a report summarizing all of this and saying it's the worst treatment of a religious minority in America since the Mormons. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, must we really drag people out of their houses and make them violate their religion? So it's really it's a very sad and nasty chapter in American history. Thankfully, the Supreme Court just 3 years later gets it right and realizes that in America, the point of the Free Exercise Clause is precisely to protect people with unpopular and minority beliefs and practices, and within broad limits to let them live out their faith. And that's the right answer in Barnett. It's the right answer for our country today. Most of the current fights about free exercise really boil down to whether you are a Barnett person or a Gobitis person. Gobitis says government gets to make the rules. They think national unity is important. They think forcing kids to say the pledge is the right way. You lose. You don't have any special rights. Barnett says, actually, no. What you say with your own mouth and what you're allowed to believe and act on, that's protected by the Constitution. The point of it is to protect minority religious beliefs and minority actions against the majority. Barnett comes to the right answer about how we do constitutional rights in this country. And thankfully, in most areas of the law, it's not even controversial anymore. That's how the Bill of Rights works. And as we get through the 20th century and you get groups like the ACLU and then NAACP and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists and other groups that are coming forward bringing cases, people start to take advantage of that and to say, okay, court, please protect my rights as against the state government that is doing me harm. First, Utah is a territory. And when Utah is a territory, Congress gets to make all its rules. And Congress can control what are the laws for marriage, for example, in the way that state governments do all the time. If Utah is to become a state, then the people of Utah get to control those things. And Congress doesn't want to allow Utah to become a state if it thinks the state government will allow for plural marriage. So in Reynolds, the court says marriage is really important and that the majority should get to define what marriage is, and that it's okay not just to stop Reynolds from getting married to more than one person, but to throw him in prison, to lock him in a cage for 5 years because he did so. The court reaches that ruling by saying that the free exercise clause really doesn't give you much protection against general laws and doesn't allow people to say, this practice is part of my religion and get out of laws. In Reynolds, the court basically says the free exercise of religion, that's what's in your heart or in your head, but it's not really how you act out in the world. And so Reynolds has a really narrow view of free exercise of religion. I mean, that's really the key takeaway from the Reynolds case, is the court saying the free exercise clause doesn't do you any good. It would do you good if it was about what you think in your head or your heart. But if it's about how you act on those things, if you want to act as if those things are really true, the free exercise clause gives you no protection. The central question in Holt v. Hobbs is really about who we are as Americans, right? So you've got a guy who's in prison for having been convicted of doing some bad, violent things. But Congress has decided that even when someone has done bad, violent things and is in prison, they're still a human being, and they still have some basic rights and some basic dignity. And one of those is that Congress has protected the exercise of religion for people in state and federal prisons. And Mr. Holt was a Muslim convert while he was in prison, and he wanted to grow a short half-inch beard. His view was that God wants him to grow facial hair and that it matters to God. He didn't want to grow a long, bushy beard that you might be able to hide stuff in. It's a short half-inch of facial hair. And in virtually every prison system in the country, including at the federal level, that would be fine. The government allows that. But the state of Arkansas said no. They said, we'd let you grow a beard if you had a medical condition, a skin problem, but if you want to grow it for religious reasons, we won't let you. And that was the fight that was at issue in Holt versus Hobbs, is does the prisoner have a right to exercise religion in that way? The state of Arkansas argued, no, that's a security threat to our prisons. That argument won them exactly 0 votes at the Supreme Court, because they let people have a lot more than half an inch of hair up here on their heads. So if you're worried about people hiding, a razor blade or something in a half an inch of hair, you should be shaving everybody bald, which they weren't doing. So the court 9-0 said, yes, sure, Mr. Holt is in prison because he was convicted of committing a real crime. But even so, we respect his dignity, and Congress has said we should respect his religious liberty, and he ought to be able to grow his short beard. And every justice on the court agreed with that. Courts have to draw a line someplace. And the interest of prisons in maintaining security is not a fake interest. It's a real interest, right? Prisons, of course, they house people who've committed crimes. It's a dangerous place, and they need to be able to have security. But the reason the government lost in Holt, and the reason the prisoner won in Holt, is that his ask was modest. He didn't say, my religion requires me to have guns in my cell. He would and should lose that claim. The government really needs to keep guns out of the hands of prisoners. He said, a half inch of hair on my face. And the court ultimately said, well, that's reasonable and that's not a threat to security. More broadly, the court always is going to have to draw lines as it applies rules in cases. What it needs to do, though, is to draw the lines that are dictated by the Constitution. And our Constitution protects the free exercise of religion so that people with beliefs that aren't necessarily popular still are supposed to get a broad range of ability to live out their religious faith, even if it's not the majority's faith. The majority is never going to need a free exercise clause or a Bill of Rights, because if the majority shares your religious beliefs, they're not going to pass a law that makes you violate those beliefs. It's only going to happen to the people with less popular beliefs and practices. And what the court needs to do is just apply the Constitution and be clear that the basic rule is that most of the time what we should do as a free and pluralistic place is respect our neighbor's ability to live out his or her faith, as long as it's not a real danger or threat to society. The basic principle is that our Constitution sets a baseline expectation that each person is guaranteed the free exercise of that religion. Of course, that can be overcome if the government has a really compelling interest, and the only way to advance that interest is to restrict somebody. So if somebody in prison says, my religious belief is I need a gun, or if I say my religious belief is I need to drive the wrong way on the highway or engage in human sacrifice, the religious person loses all those cases, as they should. But most of the time, the Constitution gives us a baseline rule that says people ought to be able to live out their faith peacefully, and the government ought to allow them to do that. We have people of different races, different religions, different sexual practices and beliefs. All that's true. America is not like one tribe of people. We're not related by blood. We are people from all over the world who came here because we are committed to certain ideas. Well, one of those ideas is the fact that you get the freedom to live out your religion. You have freedom of speech. You have freedom of exercise. And so the baseline rule in our system really is that your neighbor is allowed to be different from you and allowed to disagree with you about things that really matter. And that most of the time the answer is not that the government should crush that person or make it impossible for them to hold a job or tax them extra because they belong to the wrong church. Most of the time, the right answer to your neighbor being different from you is, welcome to America. That's what it's like to live in a diverse place, and it's okay. I think the question of religious liberty is really intertwined with what America is and who we are as a country. In America, we have deeply different beliefs about all sorts of really important questions, like God and religion and sex and marriage and war and peace. And in a free country, we're all free to come to different beliefs about those things, and I think that's a good thing. You could imagine a world where the government could dictate the answers, could establish one church or one set of right answers to all those hard questions. But I don't think any of us really wants to live there. And so the challenge for America, really since the founding, was how do we live together in peace in a place where people are allowed to have different beliefs about these really important questions? One approach to that would be to say, well, differences of opinion, that's uncomfortable. I don't really like having my neighbor disagree with me on important things. The government should stop that. Thankfully, that is not the approach we've taken in America, at least in most of our history, and it's not the modern approach. Our modern approach is much more accepting of differences, and it says that, look, your neighbor could have a very different belief than you about God or sex or abortion or marriage or whatever, and that's okay. Part of living in America is that you deal with people who are your neighbors and are good people and just disagree with you about important things. The American response to that is to live and let live, to allow your neighbor to be different so that you have the right to be different too. To talk to your neighbor, persuasion is great, but not to have the government come in and enforce conformity. Where we've gotten it wrong in our history is when we've tried to allow the government to enforce orthodoxy and enforce conformity rather than letting freedom flourish. The idea that we're not going to be a country in which the government dictates the rules and tells you, who God is, whether God is, how you worship God, those are all things that are beyond the reach of government and that free people ought to be able to figure out for themselves. And when they come to the answers, they can't use the power of government to crush the other side, right? That's really the key of free exercise, is that you are free to come to your religious beliefs and you're free to live them out. You're just not free to make the government punish people for trying to live out the wrong view of marriage, the wrong view of religion, the wrong view about something else. The founders were not a monolith. They had a lot of disagreements, but they did agree that we all are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that those rights come before government, right? That people form governments in order to protect the rights. The rights are not a gift or a handout from the king. They're something that you have by nature of being a human being. When they did that, they were coming from Europe at a time when people in Europe were killing each other over religious differences, right? They knew that religious differences really mattered and people were going to war and there was bloodshed in Europe about it. And it's not as if they came to America and those differences didn't matter. There were Catholics and Protestants and Baptists and Anglicans and Quakers, and they were all among the founders, and the disagreements were real, and they thought they were about the most important things, and their neighbors and their countrymen were killing each other over them in Europe. What the founders decided to do is to set up a system in which those divisions remain real. They weren't whitewashing them or pretending they didn't exist, but those divisions wouldn't become the basis for crushing the person with the minority belief. They wouldn't become the basis for running people out of town or out of the country. Instead, we'd learn to live together in peace, even though we have these differences. And that was the first American lesson, really, about freedom and democracy and how do you make them all work together. And it's one we're still learning and living through today, but it set us on, what ultimately I think is the right course, which is it's okay for my neighbor to be different. It's okay for my neighbor to disagree with me about God. There's plenty of space here for us each to live out our own separate view of the world, and that the government shouldn't come in trying to tell either one of us what the right answer is or punish us for believing the wrong one. There's a reason that the freedom of speech and the freedom of press and the freedom to assemble and petition the government and the freedom of religion, they're all in the First Amendment because they're all part of this basic idea of how do we think, how do we form our values, how do we convince our fellow countrymen that something is or isn't right. So you can't really have a free society unless you protect those things. And often they overlap, right? Martin Luther King was both a leader of protests and a reverend, right? And he made openly religious arguments to help convince the country to get rid of Jim Crow and to accept the equality of all people as equal children of God. So those things often travel together, and any government that can restrain one is a threat to them all and is a threat to freedom. In Employment Division versus Smith, the court ends up giving the Free Exercise Clause a super narrow range of protection. It only protects you if the government singles you out and tries to get you for your religion. But of course, that's not only or even the main way governments might restrict somebody's religion. Often governments stop people from practicing their religion because they're just ignorant about some minority religious belief or they don't know. If you imagine people of different faiths, we're going to need different rules. If you outlaw eating, if you make everybody eat pork, I'm Catholic, that's not going to bother me. I kind of like bacon. But if I were Jewish, it would really matter to me, right? So the truth is, if people are free to pick different religions, then laws will hit them differently. And what Smith said is, as long as it's the same law for everybody, the Free Exercise Clause gives you no protection. That was wrong at the time, and to their great credit, both sides of the aisle politically, the Republicans and the Democrats, came together. You had groups as diverse as the ACLU and the U.S. Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops showing up together and saying, we agree on this. And what they agreed on is that we're supposed to have broad protection for religious liberty. Congress passed it overwhelmingly. Religious groups of all stripes supported it. Bill Clinton said signing that law was one of the proudest moments of his first term as president. And so it's really a time where we came together with a broad view of religious liberty, saying that people really ought to be able to peacefully live out different religious beliefs, and it's okay to be different. That's what RFRA is a broad democratic reaction to a case that Americans thought the court got gravely wrong. And it embraces the broad view of religious exercise, what I think is the right view of religious exercise, and says, if the court wants to say that's what the Constitution means, I guess that's their turf. But as a matter of what federal law means, Congress can say federal law means we're going to have broad protections for religion. When RFRA was enacted, religious liberty was a bipartisan thing that most people could agree on. It's become much more controversial in, say, the last 25 years, which is a shame and is not a good thing. We would do well to get back to the era where we can disagree without thinking the government needs to punish people who have the quote-unquote wrong religion. But so it's changed in that it used to be more broadly accepted. It's gotten more controversial, but I'll point out this. Even in some cases that you might think of as really controversial, the Supreme Court can still get to 9-0 rulings and can still say, well, we can disagree a lot on this or that, but we agree on this principle. And I think that's a hopeful sign for the country. I think most people really can live and let live and understand that it's okay for somebody else to be different. Unfortunately, I think there's some people at the far end of the spectrum who want to stamp out religion. That's a problem. But I actually think most people are people of goodwill who can get along just fine with someone who's different from them. I think America's story has been one of immigrants and different people coming here to find freedom, really from the founding. Like at the very outset, the Pilgrims came here because they were religiously different and they wanted a place to set up their own way of doing things. So that's part of the American story. for a long time, the waves of Catholic immigrants, the Mormon immigrants. They would come over, they would be seeking freedom, they would run into some difficulties with the people who were here when they got here. That's always been part of the story. The Immigration Act of 1965 opens it up more broadly. We get more influx of more people of different faiths into the country over the last 60 years than we had before that. That's wonderful in that it adds to our diversity. That's also a challenge in that it makes us have to work through how do we deal with this diversity. Ultimately, the right answer is what the right answer always was, which is you've got a neighbor who's got a different religious belief. That's interesting. Go meet your neighbor and get to know your neighbor and chat about it. It is not to say, oh, that's a different belief and I want my government to keep those people out. That's never been the good American response, and I hope it never becomes it. The court has been acting to provide greater protection to religious liberty in the past couple of decades, getting back to what I think really is the right approach from Barnett and getting away from the stingy approach that we see in Gobitis and Employment Division versus Smith. Gobitis got it wrong. Gobitis had a very stingy, narrow view of religious exercise and a stingy view of the Bill of Rights and said that didn't provide a lot of protection for minority groups. Barnett changed that in a really good way, and Barnett said, the Supreme Court said in Barnett, that the Bill of Rights is supposed to pick certain principles and say that's beyond the reach of the majority. This principle is a principle in the Constitution that the majority can't change. Minorities get these rights, and that's done on purpose, and that's how we should enforce the Bill of Rights. Barnett sets that principle in a way that really applies to most of our First Amendment rights and most of our individual rights throughout the Constitution. But unfortunately, in Employment Division versus Smith, the court goes back to that stingy Gobitis view of how we'll protect religious exercise and says the Free Exercise Clause really doesn't give you much protection. So that's bad. But since then, what has happened? One, RFRA, Congress, has changed that through the RFRA statute so that you have broad federal statutory protections. Many states have changed their own state laws to either adopt RFRAs or interpret their state constitution to follow the Barnett rule, not the Gobitis rule. And then the Supreme Court over the last 30 years has been taking steps in a variety of cases to say that religious exercise is supposed to get broad protection. In a sense, they've been shrinking the space in which the Smith case is really the rule of decision. So through a line of cases over the past dozen years or so, they've been protecting religious exercise even if Smith might have made you think it wouldn't get protected, and I think that's a good thing. That's the court getting back to the Barnett approach to individual rights and free exercise. Free exercise means to me that I get to live out my own understanding of God and what God wants of me and what I should do based on who created me and what I'm sent here to do. And so does my neighbor, and they don't have to be the same. So free exercise means I can raise my children in my religious beliefs. They can raise their children in their religious beliefs. We will live in a place where those are different, and our neighbors won't all think the same things we do. And I think that's a lovely thing. I think it's good to live in a place where there's diversity. I believe my religious beliefs are true, and so I'm happy to try to convince people that mine are true. But it's a free country, and all I can or should do is offer ideas to people, and the idea that the government could tell either one of us the right answer would be terrible. And I hope I would never support a government, even if the government said, Mark Rienzi's religious beliefs are right. I still don't want a government taking those beliefs and trying to make people have them. That's not free exercise. Free exercise is people being able to come to beliefs on their own, to convince one another, to change minds. That's what freedom looks like.